Very much. I've got 30 minutes to tell you a little bit about ASAP and the background, how this idea started and why we think it's important. And of course, where better to begin than with the poverty numbers as we get them. One thing that you will learn tomorrow is that these numbers themselves are highly contested, and of course there's a huge amount of fraud going on with these numbers. So just a few days ago, the hunger numbers were revised quite dramatically, and what was regress is now progress. And the biggest revision is in the year 1990, where suddenly there were 160 million more hungry people than before. 1990 is, of course, the start year of the MDGs. And so the whole trend looks much better if things were worse back then in 1990. Anyway, these are the numbers as you find them in official publications. And I've taken the latest numbers on all these different deprivations. You can see here that very large numbers in the world are still suffering these really severe deprivations of one sort or another. They're chronically undernourished, don't have a place to stay, don't have electricity, clean drinking water, literacy, adequate sanitation, and so on. These numbers are amazingly high, of course, many, many times the population of all of Canada. And yet, in a way, you might say that these numbers understate the magnitude of the problem, in that these numbers are a snapshot representation of the world. They show you the world at one moment in time, and so they naturally overrepresent the people whose lives are longer and underrepresent the people whose lives are shorter. And as this diagram here shows, these are not actual numbers but rough estimates. But as these numbers show, it's quite consistent to say that a third of all human lives are lived in the bottom fifth of the human population. It sounds impossible, but yet if you think about it, it's actually quite true. The living and dying is much quicker, so there's more turnover, to use a cruel phrase, in the bottom fifth than in the other quintiles. And so if we, as we should, I think, morally give equal weight to each human life, the picture would look even worse. Here's a statistic that does not make the mistake of overweighting the people whose lives are long. This is the statistic on how people die. And here you can see that roughly a third of all human deaths, so 18 million a year, are from poverty-related causes of one sort or another. And it's a pretty conservative statistic in that I've only taken those causes of death which are essentially unknown among wealthy populations. Obviously, poor people die from the same things we die from as well. They die from heart disease, diabetes, and so on. And often much sooner than we do, because they have greater environmental risk factors and also lousy medical care, if any. And so in that sense, many poor people die prematurely from these other causes, but I haven't counted any of those deaths. I've only counted those causes of death which are essentially unknown among the rich and confined to the poor. That's 18 million, quite a lot, and if you put that in perspective, comparing it with the great catastrophes of the 20th century, you see that this number is really quite big. In 22 years, about 400 million poverty deaths. That's since the end of the Cold War. All the wars, civil wars, gulags, concentration camps, great leaps forward, and so on of the 20th century have together killed about 200 million people in the entire century. So 400 million really is big, and you can see here that we don't pay anywhere near as much attention as we should to the problem of poverty. Now, it's clear that poverty violates human rights. Certainly this kind of severe poverty that we are talking about. We all committed to the Universal Declaration. We celebrate it every December. And it says there, right in the Universal Declaration and in many other subsequent human rights documents, that we are committed to everyone having the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of oneself, one's family, food, clothing, and so on. So just imagine, here we have a human right that for roughly half the human population isn't fulfilled. This is not just a very small problem here or there, but it's a very, very significant number of people. Now, the human rights language should remind us of one thing, namely how perverse it is to talk constantly about the question, are things getting better or are they not getting better? Right? Once you realize that something is a human rights violation, the fact that it's getting better, sure, it's better to get better than to get worse. But what we need to think about always is how much of this human rights under-fulfillment is strictly speaking necessary. So imagine, just to fix ideas, just imagine somebody had said, in 1942, when the news about the concentration camps came out, somebody had said, well, you know, is it getting more or less? Are there more people than 5 months ago or fewer? So there's progress, good. Or imagine, to take another example, Roosevelt at the time saying, you know, we should try to cut this by 27%, the number of people in concentration camps over 25 years. So that 25 years from now, there's only half as large a percentage of Jewish population in the concentration camps, something of that sort. We would have said the man has lost his mind. But that's what we are saying about poverty. We are saying, let's try to get it down in 25 years, let's try to get it down to half of what it was. Not exactly half, because we're doing it in terms of percentage relative to population, so it's really only a 29% reduction. But if we do that, if we progressively realize this human right, then we basically have done our job, and we can feel good about ourselves because there's progress. So the crucial point here, the first crucial point, is the benchmark has to be not what was yesterday, how many people were in the concentration camp yesterday, how much slavery was there yesterday. The benchmark has to be how much is strictly unavoidable. And we have to get it down to that level as quickly as we possibly can. That is simply what it means to recognize something as a human right. So now, why do we have this? Why do we have so much poverty? We have an average income in the world of $10,000 nearly. We are almost there. $10,000 per head in the world. And yet, people are living on these incredibly small salaries, around $100, $150 a year. So how is that possible? The initial answer, of course, is, well, it is because of income inequality. We heard a lot about this morning. Actually, it was very sane for me to hear economists talk, Canadian economists, as opposed to what I get below the border, to get a sane view about what's going on economically in the world. Here you see the global income distribution, household income distribution, thanks to Branko Milanovic, one of the sane people at the World Bank, who develops these numbers. So the top light blue is you guys, the top 5% of the world's population. This is the next 20%. So what you now have is the first quarter of the human population, a little over 90%. Not much left for the other 3 quarters. Here they are. And the bottom quarter in red. So you can see very, very skewed income distribution. Why is income so skewed, and why is this inequality increasing? There are obviously a zillion factors why this happens. The one that I want to focus attention on is one that we are more responsible for than for other factors, and that we can also do more about. And that's simply regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is a phenomenon that is familiar to all of us, especially in a US election year, where you can see it firsthand right on the screen of your television set, where people are buying and selling political votes on this, that, and the other thing, where issues come and go depending on how sponsors are funding them or not funding them, or often mobilizing large amounts of money against them, like the environment these days. So regulatory capture is a well-known phenomenon. In any competitive system, there are 2 ways of getting ahead. One is you do what the system rewards better than the next guy, and you get the rewards that the system promises. The other is you find ways of changing the rules of the game, or the application of those rules, and get ahead thereby. You send lobbyists to Washington if you want to get a contract with the Pentagon, for example, rather than building the best aircraft. You send a whole bunch of people to Washington and try to influence those who decide about who will get the contract for the next aircraft. Now, in this lobbying game, the strongest have a great advantage. It's much easier for them to mobilize, and also they have the incentives. Right? If I had a big lobbying effort to reduce my tax rate by 2 or 3%, it wouldn't clearly pay back the effort. It would not be a good investment. But if I were a hedge fund manager with a salary or an income of $200 million a year or something like that, it would be worth my effort to try to get lobbyists to go to Washington for me and to try to get that tax rate down. And I guess that's the reason why in the United States we have a special tax rate for hedge fund managers and no special tax rate for philosophy professors. So the tax rate for hedge fund managers is 15%. That's the most that they pay. Everybody else pays somewhere in the mid-30s in federal income taxes. And you've seen Warren Buffett, for example, commenting that he was the person with the lowest tax rate in his entire office, including all the office staff and so on. Good. So inequality spirals are generated by the fact that those who have the most have the experience, the knowledge, the expertise, the incentives, and the opportunities to lobby in order to change the rules in their own favor. They will do this only when they have good prospects of actually succeeding. If they succeed, they will capture an even greater share of the income, the social product, and that will in the next round enable them to do even better in regard to the lobbying efforts. It will give them even stronger incentives, even better opportunities. Now here's something new under the sun, or relatively new in the last 20 years or so. We have had a whole new lobbying arena opening up with the end of the Cold War. Globalization has happened. Globalization means many things. One thing it means is the shifting upward of rules. So rules are now increasingly made at the global level, or supranational level, I should say. And they reach deep into the inner lives of national societies, determining national legislation and determining many of the increasingly frequent cross-border transactions that take place, trade, investment, and so on and so forth. So the fixing of these rules has been highly contested, and an enormous amount of lobbying has gone on trying to influence the way these new rules get shaped. There's a whole new city being built there, a whole new global or supranational institutional architecture. And those people who got in on the ground floor influencing how that architecture gets designed, those people really benefited tremendously. Why is that? Well, one big reason is that politics is very different at the supranational level from how it is here, right? When anybody wants to change the rules in Canada, they have to write this down on a piece of paper, exactly what the rule changes are that they want. They have to publicize that. That's very public in the Parliament. Canadian citizens can look before any law gets passed what the content of that law is, and so forth. There's a big public debate about it, and if you don't like what you see, you can mobilize against it. Now try that at supranational negotiations. You don't have any chance of finding out what these guys are negotiating behind closed doors, and you're not privy to the discussions. Corporations are. They normally get, through their lobbyists, advance information of what's being negotiated. But ordinary citizens, even privileged ones like you and me, don't get that information. In fact, it's very difficult afterwards to get a sense of why particular things got into the treaty text, who influenced, who pushed for this, how did this language get in, which country was instrumental. You can often guess, but there is no publicity there, no accountability, no transparency, and certainly no democracy. So it's an ideal environment for lobbying, and you lobby through your government. So if you have a pretty strong position in the United States, for example, you lobby the US government, you say you want certain rules to be gotten out of these negotiations for you, and you make it worth the while of the incumbents in the White House in particular to get you the rules that you want. A wonderful example of that we'll get to know not tomorrow but the day after, the TRIPS agreement. protecting intellectual property rights much more strongly than they were protected before TRIPS. India came under TRIPS on the 1st of January 2005, and since then prices of advanced medicines have shot up in India and also in all the other developing countries, because you can't be a member of the WTO without having subscribed to the TRIPS agreement. So this supranational lobbying, I think, has contributed quite greatly, quite substantially, to the increase in inequality that was observed this morning. It's not the only reason, of course, but it's one very significant reason. And here the US is a major conduit for the obvious reasons that, on the one hand, it's a country in which politics are bought and sold quite openly, and on the other hand, it is still the strongest negotiation party in international negotiations. Now, if this were true, you would expect that US-based billionaires, banks, and multinational corporations should have done especially well in this globalization period. And this is actually what we find. We already had this morning somebody say something about the Kuznets curve, right? That wonderful curve that tells you inequality goes up as a country matures, and don't worry, it goes down again. It's exactly what happened in the US, except that then something illegal happened. The Kuznets curve was violated, and inequality jumped off the rails and is now as high as it was at its peak in the late 20s, just before the Great Depression. So here's the development of national income inequality. 78 was the bottom. That was the lowest inequality year. These numbers are from the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service of the United States. And what you see here is that, as the Occupy Wall Street movement quite rightly points out, the gains are concentrated in the top 1%, which experienced a 2.6-fold increase in its share of national household income, from roughly 9 to 23.5%. But look at how the top 100th of 1%, it had a 7-fold increase, going from 0.86 to 6.04%. So an explosion. The top 100th of 1% of the US population, it's just 14,400 tax returns or 30,000 people, is now having as much income, about half as much income as the bottom half of Americans, or US citizens, I should say, and as much income as the bottom 40% of the world's population. So 40% of the world's population, about 2.8 billion people, have about as much income as the top 14,400 US taxpayers. Now, the ways in which that worked, is the particular supranational rules that I think aggravate inequality and blow a headwind into the faces of the poor, are these 7 here. I don't have time to go into them in detail, but we'll revisit some of them hopefully in this 3-day conference. And you can more or less guess what they are. The grandfathering in of protectionist rules, the blatant violation of the polluter pays principle, the harms go to the poor, the benefits go to the rich, illicit financial flows which suck more than $1 trillion out of the developing world each year due to embezzlement and tax evasion mostly, the 4 privileges which basically enable dictators in poor countries, poor but resource-rich countries, to sell the resources of their country, to get paid for those, and then to remain in power through the weapons that they purchase from us and the support that they buy from the military. Pharmaceuticals is the problem that I already mentioned with the TRIPS agreement. Lack of labor standards. While we have very nice uniform intellectual property standards in the WTO, we have no labor standards. And the arms trade, which also wreaks havoc in many countries, especially in Africa. Now, this is the dynamic picture of global household income. This was the distribution in 1988. Unfortunately, the computer is a little different, so the numbers are missing. You can see here what happened between 88 and 2005. I'm flipping this back and forth. The only winner globally was the top 5%, which gained 3.5% of global household income in this period. Everybody else lost, and you can see here in the bottom left corner that the bottom quarter lost the most. They lost about a third of their share of global household income. So inequality is increasing, and it's increasing so that the top, the very top, gains substantially, and the very bottom loses the most. So it's really a phenomenon of the extremes. To quickly summarize the key facts, in 17 years, the gain of the top 5% was larger than what the whole bottom half of the human population had left at the end of that period. The top 5% gained 3.5%. The bottom half had less than 3% left by the time the period was over. The ratio in average incomes went from 185 to 1 to 297 to 1. That's the top 5% versus the bottom quarter. If the poorer half had simply just maintained their share of global household income, they would now be 21% richer on average. And for the poorest quarter, the corresponding number is 49%. If they had simply just held steady, they would be 49% better off. Had the bottom half been allowed to gain the 3.5% that in fact was gained by the top 5% of the world's population, their share would have increased from 3.5% to 7%, and poverty would be history. So the same sort of shift that actually took place towards the top, if it had taken place towards the bottom half, that would have been the end of poverty. We could have done it. And that would have brought everybody above the $3 a day international dollars poverty line. So more than twice what the World Bank thinks poverty should be defined as. Again, human rights should be mentioned in this context. We have a very far-sighted article here in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights saying that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. That's evidently what we don't have now. We do not have such an international order, and we could easily have one by reforming this order in the various ways that I indicated earlier on the diagram looking like this one. We are responsible, our governments, and ultimately we are responsible for the supranational institutional arrangements being the way they are. And I think this is a responsibility that we should try to discharge by mobilizing politically through our governments to try to change especially those features of the supranational order that are particularly harmful for the poor. This ends then in two citizen responsibilities: to work toward these supranational institutional reforms, and in the meanwhile also to try to compensate for the harms that the unreformed institutional arrangements still wreak. Here is where ASAP comes in. So our thoughts about ASAP are basically that we think that academics can play a very important role here. And many have asked, why academics? Shouldn't academics, they are somewhat otherworldly creatures, shouldn't they just be in their ivory tower and try to do no damage? And we think that academics have an important role to play. And the first thing to say to those who say, well, what about academics potentially doing damage, is to say, well, academics are already all over this issue and almost always on the wrong side. There are lots and lots of economists preaching the merits of the status quo, how a rising tide is lifting all boats, how things are getting better, helping to measure and remeasure in ever new creative accounting ways poverty and deprivation in such ways that it looks like there is some progress. And so it's very important, I think, that academics are also on the other side, on the side of the poor, critically looking at the consensus views and questioning them and directing attention to the kind of research topics that are understudied. For example, there's a huge amount of literature in the development economics world about why a particular country did well and another country did poorly. There's very little literature on how global or supranational institutional arrangements of this or that sort have affected poverty trajectories. A second point, a second argument is there's really nobody else out there who is lending a voice to the poor. Of course, the poor have their own voices, but they're often not educated, and more importantly, they are removed from the microphones. They have no way to publish books, to publish blogs, to get into the media, and we can help them do that. And of course, what we always need to do is be in touch with them and not just simply play this game on our own. The third point is the enormous urgency of the problem, which I hope I've displayed in the first few slides. The magnitude of the problem, its absolutely clear avoidability, and also our involvement through our governments, which are lobbied by our corporations, in favor of designing rules that clearly are harmful to the poor. There's fourthly the ideal role of educators to participate in public discourse, to lift public discourse, to make it critical, to make it fully informed by the facts, which I think we can, as academics, do quite well. And then finally, we also have skills in clarifying issues, in getting to clear about the description of the poverty problem, about its explanation. We talked this morning about causality already, about the assessment of the problem, what are the responsibilities that various agents have with regard to poverty, and finally about reform possibilities and who has forward-going responsibilities to try to help initiate the reforms that are urgently needed. So I think academics can make a huge contributions. We can't do it on our own, but we could well make a difference together with other agents such as NGOs, international organizations, and we can be a big morale booster. Because let's face it, after all these years of defeat, after all this regrets, where so many hopes about poverty have been dashed in the last 30, 40 years, a lot of the people who fight the good fight for poverty eradication are deeply demoralized. And here again, academics could be very helpful. So that's partly a reflection on my own generation, which I think has been the generation that started out with great hopes. In the 60s and 70s, there was a big youth movement where we thought we could solve the problems of the world and poverty, developing countries, and so on. And in these 30, 40 years, I think things have moved backwards. Certainly, if you take the appropriate benchmark, maybe compare the world to what would be possible rather than merely to what has been. So what is ASAP? ASAP is basically a platform where we are trying to make it possible for academics from different disciplines and different countries, and especially across North and South, to genuinely collaborate together in the interest of poverty eradication, where we will do outreach beyond the academy to try to connect with poor people, try to connect with media, to connect with NGOs, with international organizations, with government organizations insofar as governments are genuinely interested. And the name of the game is impact. We really measure our success or failure as an organization by looking at what we can actually achieve on the poverty front. Obviously, that can't be measured with any precision, but it can be the focus of our work throughout to try really to make a difference, not just to discuss poverty, but to help reduce it, to help make it history. What do we do? Well, we do anything that works in principle. So the projects that I will show you are projects that have already been mentioned to some extent, are projects that are just examples of what we have started in the 1.5 years. We are now 1 year and 5 months old. So what we have started to do and what is cooking, so to speak, but new projects can emerge at any time, and we will help you design projects, connect with people who can help with the project, and so on. So we expect many more projects to emerge as ASAP matures. One project is Know Your Rights India, where we want to have an integrated website that would allow poor people to figure out what rights and entitlements they have, and more importantly, which agents and agencies are relevantly related to it. Where do I go if I have a complaint? Where do I go if the officer in charge demands a bribe as a condition of letting me have my right? What NGOs are working in this area? Who can help me in filling out a form if I can't read or write, and so on. So all these kinds of helps would be provided by Know Your Rights India, and that is one of our projects about which Ashok Acharya can say more. We have a project on moral psychology and poverty alleviation, which was already mentioned, where we are trying to figure out what is it that makes it possible for people who really know better about what goes on with regard to poverty and that they should make some contribution to the fight against poverty, what makes it possible for them to shut themselves off from that knowledge and to somehow be insensitive to poverty? What keeps people from doing what is obviously the right thing here to do? And again, we have in the course of the conference some presentations on that. This is the most urgent focus in the moment. The Beyond 2015 project is trying to weigh in on what should replace the Millennium Development Goals, which we think in some ways, of course, have been a success. It was good that the world had this focus at all, but in many ways a wasted opportunity, as we will discuss tomorrow in great detail. In any case, there's a fantastic opportunity coming up to do something beyond 2015, to force the hand of the powers that be into designing real goals, with real targets, real responsibilities given to specific agents in a way that would make progress far more likely than it was under the MDGs. And finally, there is also the Health Impact Fund project, which we'll discuss more on Saturday morning, which has to do with a way of getting around the TRIPS agreement, basically allowing pharmaceutical innovators to register a new medicine for reward payments conditioned on health impact, on condition that they sell the product at cost. So it would give pharmaceutical companies an alternative. They don't have to make money by marking up their product to 50 times the cost of production. They can also sell it at cost and be paid through health impact rewards. Here's a quick look at the current list of directors. These are the people, 6 of them are here, 3 are too far to bring. And here you've got the advisory board, people who have been kind enough to weigh in and to stand ready to help us with good advice as we go forward with our work. Thank you.